Good day. This is another installment of American History 1301. This is a lecture on the French Revolution and its impact upon the United States and the first administrations in the new United States under the Constitution of 1787. The U.S. government, whether it was the Adams administration or first the Washington administration, then John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and all those that follow after him, all of those men and their secretaries of state and other members of the Congress and the governmental apparatus are going to have to deal with one of the great issues of the early 19th century. And actually starts in the late 18th century, and that is the changes in the upheaval wrought by the French Revolution. Whereas the American Revolution was obviously radical in the sense that it overthrows the king and sets up a new republic in the form of the U.S. government, eventually through the Constitution. The American Revolution was never as radical by any stretch of the imagination as that of the French Revolution. The American Revolution overthrew the king, but did not overthrow society, did not overthrow the church, did not do this, that, and the other. It was not a social revolution. The fact of the matter is when you talk about the French Revolution, it is completely radical. It's one of the great radical revolutions in the history of really the modern world, I suppose, and maybe the history of the world, period. The French Revolution is not just going to eventually execute and depose the king and perform what's called regicide. It's also going to depose the church in many respects. France religiously is never the same again. The French Revolution is also going to strip not just the church from land and money and prestige and position, but the French Revolution is also going to strip and execute many of the elites and aristocrats who had been in and around the orbit of the king. And on top of that, of course, very famously, as laid out and recorded by Charles Dickens, most somewhat accurately, but certainly with great flair and verve, The Tale of Two Cities, that Charles Dickens book that some of you have had to read. The French Revolution is going to be a completely consuming event. You'll have riots and mobs, you'll have the reign of terror, you'll have terrorism or tyranny, you'll have just a complete reordering society, down to the point where we're having a new calendar, new days of the week, and even new time. So you've got this whole, this is a whole encompassing event, and it is fearfully radical. And the thing is that many people who are going to get swept up into this, and many of whom were either ambivalent about it or opposed to it, just simply, I mean, this is scary stuff. And so what you'll see as the French Revolution gets going and really takes on a life of its own and becomes the all-encompassing and consuming event that we know it to be now, you're going to see a reaction against it by many of the monarchical powers or those who are just simply more conservative than were the radical French revolutionaries. And that would include Great Britain, Austria, Prussia, and so forth. So what happens is, because of the French Revolution in Europe, the French Revolution is going to consume the oxygen, the proverbial oxygen of politics in Europe, and it's going to plunge Europe into a series of wars. Europe had been at war at times for some time, but basically from the year 1789, which is the beginning of the French Revolution, and in fact, actually, I would remember it this way in your notes, July 14th, 1789 is called Bastille Day, the storming of the Bastille, which was frankly a more or less defunct French political prison, but at the same time has great symbolic value, and is generally speaking, and for our purposes, considered the beginning of the French Revolution, all the way through out until about 1815. So 1789 to 1815, a long period of time. The French Revolution, or later after the Revolution is over, you're going to see the emergence or the ending of the Revolutionary period and the emergence of the Napoleonic Empire period. And those are all going to be completely upheaval events in the history of Europe. It's always important to remember with regard to the United States is a small institution. It's a weakling nation. I said that before to you. I say that again. The United States is not any superpower economically, militarily, or anything else. And so we are really kind of helpless, to some degree at least, in the face of the great fight to the finish. And that's really something worth remembering here. the British and the French are going to be in essentially a death match, a death struggle, not unlike, say, the Germans and the British of the World Wars, or the French and the Germans in the First World War. The fact is this is a massive struggle, and the United States gets sucked into the vortex, and we find ourselves with not much way out. So that's an introduction into it, and I'll go back to the American experience for just a second in a bit in this lecture. But I want to spend a few minutes of time, in fact, maybe a good 15 to 20 minutes lecturing on the Revolution itself to kind of give you an idea how expansive this is, where it came from, where it went, and where it ended up grinding out at. As I said to you, the French Revolution began formally on July 14th, 1789, with the storming of the Bastille, that prison just outside of, right outside of France, or right outside of Paris, excuse me. But the rumblings of the the rumblings of the Revolution are going to be found well before July 14th. You can find it in the form of monetary problems borne by the French crown. One of the great problems of the French nation, and it at least in some respects should be a wealthy nation or at least a prosperous nation, is that the French crown had spent itself and had spent tons of treasure trying to bring about the American Revolution. Truth be told, we Americans would not have won. I firmly believe this as a historian. We Americans would not have won the revolution, our revolution, without the assistance of the French and the French monarchy. Louis XVI is going to spend valuable amounts of treasure trying to bring in and trying to save, or rather to deliver a black eye, maybe more than a black eye, to the British Empire. We thank him for his money, we thank him for his troops, we thank him for his navy, because without those assistances, we couldn't have won the thing, but we did. And however, though, for the French, the unintended consequence was the proverbial Pyrrhic victory. You won your victory against the British, yet at the same time you ultimately sowed the seeds of your own doom and defeat. So the French monarchy has an issue with money, or the lack thereof. And it leaks out, and then on top of that, so how do you raise money? The French are not, they're not capitalistic anywhere compared to the British. The French are very much more mercantilistic, much more traditional in a Latin sense, I suppose. But the fact is that you're going to need to raise taxes, and those taxes are going to be borne disproportionately, not upon the church, which had a large amount of money and holdings, or upon the aristocrats for all intents and purposes. Much of it would be borne by the rank and file peasant. You're going to also have, you're not only going to have a bankruptcy issue, you're also going to have some issues with regard to the lack of respect for the king and the queen. The king, Louis XVI, is rightly understood at times as a dithering monarch. At times when he should have been active and aggressive, he was retiring and ambivalent and apathetic, it seemed like. Other times when he was aggressive, he came across as petulant. And so the man himself, Louis XVI, through his reign, especially as you get closer and closer to his execution and his deposing, Louis XVI becomes more and more of a figure of basically a figure of reproach, a figure of ridicule, and so forth. And it's not just the poor and the peasant who is going to laugh at the king, and arguably they were actually more loyal to the king, at least initially, than were the elites. But the elites and the aristocrats, including the members of the church, which at times were part of the elite, especially in the upper echelons of the Roman Catholic Church. Always important to remember that France is Roman Catholic to its core, with a few major exceptions like the Huguenots. But there was much ridicule and much speculation about the king's abilities or inabilities. Some of it were salacious regarding his bedroom habits, particularly with his wife, or his wife's bedroom habits, his monetary problems, his dysfunctions, and so forth. So there's a lack of respect for the king. But in addition to that, his wife, Marie Antoinette, though she never, in all likelihood, she never says, "Let them eat cake," as far as I'm concerned, she really never endeared herself to her people. She always came across as cold and distant, just aristocratic, spent too much money in a time of bankruptcy. It just many chords that were struck wrongly by Marie. She was, I just kind of would say she was out of her depth as a monarch. She never probably should have been a queen of France, but at the same time, history thrust her there, and she floundered. But also it's worth noting, too, is that ridicule and all that laughing at and behind the backs of the king. Of course, you'd never literally laugh at him to his face. But the thing is that all these things are going to take place in the Parisian, especially Paris's salons, their Masonic lodges. The Masonic lodge is very big and very active in France, as it was actually in England as well, and the cafes. If any of you have ever been to Paris, famously there's been many cafes, salons, and so forth. The fact is that when we talk about those meeting places, those areas where you can drink, not to excess like a beer joint or a college tavern where you go get blitzed, but you talk, you drink, you speculate, you gossip, and you laugh and you mock and you make fun. It creates a corrosive atmosphere, and the corrosion and the acid that is eating at the authority of the leadership, the crown and his wife and their hangers-on and their sycophants, is terribly corrosive to the base and authority of society. And this actually, I would say, takes place first and foremost amongst the elites who are laughing at the king, as I said, and less so, at least not initially, with the people. In fact, actually, the people, it seems like, at least in the early days of the pre-dawn of the revolution, in the early days of the revolution, many people wanted to believe in their king, wanted to support their king. The people did. But eventually, Louis screws that up with some disastrous moves. Well, in addition to that, too, is that you're going to see not only the issue of ridicule, you'll also see shortages. And this also, the inability of the government, the crown, to provide food and help and shelter, the basics of society, the basic needs. You have shortages in food, shortages in clothing, shortages, especially amongst the peasant class. And France, at the same time, those shortages were brought on by the fact that you will have, in the years prior to 1789, a series of disastrous harvests that the king is unable to effect. Of course, he's a king, not a god. But when you are the top person, divinely inspired and divinely placed on the throne by the Almighty Himself, and you do nothing about harvest and so forth, there's complaint. Now, to be clear, there had been famine before in the land, and you've had divine right of kings for years, so this is nothing new. But the word got around, and it was somewhat true, is that while the people, especially the peasants, were being overtaxed and overburdened and beat down and starving in some cases, but certainly hungry in others, the king's warehouses were full of grains, and they were not being shared and distributed in the time of lean. So that would have been...
Just a sec.
That's an interesting development. I'm sitting here lecturing away, and then all of a sudden my phone kicked over to Siri. I guess I ought to restart this, but I don't know how to pause and get going and whatever, so I'm just going to go with it. And so for however long I use this lecture, there's going to be a Siri note on my phone, and it did not turn it on, so maybe the government's listening to me on this and whatever. I need to be paranoid. But all that to say, though, is that the king has got problems. There's shortages in the land. And all these things, whether it's the ridicule, the shortages of food, the problems in the church with its, especially, I'm not talking about the priest who's out in the countryside. I'm talking about the bishops and the cardinals who populate the upper echelons of society. All this put together, the bankruptcy of the crown, it's just all creating this perfect storm that's going to ultimately upend society. But one other thing that's worth noting too, what we call the Enlightenment, the Enlightenment that is John Locke, and what we've studied so far in this course, we've looked at it from an English perspective, which is, in a sense, radical. I mean, Locke talks about life, liberty, and property, and the right to overthrow the king if the king or the government becomes tyrannical. Well, that is radical. But in 1700s England, you never had the censorship in England, especially in the 1700s as time goes forward. You never have the censorship that you see in France. You had, for all intents and purposes, compared to France, a relatively open society. And that seemed to, in England and in Scotland and so forth, that seemed to create a kind of an outlet and a relief valve, as it were, a pressure relief valve that allowed England to sidestep the radical aspects of the French Revolution. England had had the Glorious Revolution. England had had the killing of Charles I with Cromwell back in the 1600s. I understand that. But at the same time is that England, though the Enlightenment came there, the English Enlightenment always was a good deal more moderate than the French revolutionary version. One of the two major differences in the French revolutionary, the French Enlightenment versus the English Enlightenment is the ideal of equality. In fact, actually, the tricolors of France, the tricolor of France, the red, the white, and the blue. If you've seen it, it's got three separate bars. Kind of refer to, amongst other things, the three great watchwords of the Revolution: liberty, fraternity, equality. Equality, and really a radical equality, is one of the major issues that you see in the revolution, in the post-revolutionary period. This idea of equality, the leveling of society, the stripping, in the case of the church, the stripping of lands and property and authority and position, the stripping of the aristocrats, radical equality. And how do you achieve radical equality? As the French Revolution will discover it and push it, it will be a radical equality that will go further and further than had been conceived of in England. And sometimes that means, to use another revolutionary's very famous pet phrase, sometimes you have to crack a few eggs to make an omelet. The man who said that was Vladimir Lenin of the Soviet Union, or the Bolshevik fame. But anyways, all that to say, though, is that equality was a radical idea, and more particularly the way it's implemented is even far more radical, and it's implemented in rivers of blood. In addition to that, charity, the idea of radical charity, was also included in this French revolutionary idea that perhaps redistribution of wealth or something like that you could be thrown into the mix too. So the French Revolution is going to come about with a kind of a perfect storm, a perfect mixture of ideas, situation on the ground, ridicule, cynicism, idealism. All that put together brings about the French Revolution, and it gets going. The French Revolution is going to change society governmentally. Famously, of course, we have the execution of the king, and of course the great symbol, or one of the great symbols, maybe the greatest symbol of the excess of the revolution, of the killing in the revolution, the reign of terror in the revolution, is going to be the guillotine. You know, the guillotine, that sharpened, or at least supposedly sharpened blade that cuts your head off and so forth. And many thousands of people will go to their deaths because of the guillotine. But the thing is that governmentally it reorders society. You're going to see in the French Revolution not only a new king, or the deposing of the king, and really in a sense never one to return, though Napoleon simply acted like it at times, though he never called himself that. You're going to see new capitals. You're going to have new districts, which would be a very, very rough equivalent to states in the United States. I got to be careful with that statement, but new governing districts, new capitals of those governing districts, new places for courts. They're going to move a county seat or a court seat and move it from one town to the next. So how you've done business for years and years has changed. Something else that's very radical, might not seem like it to us because we kind of take it for granted, or just we've downplayed it perhaps in society. It depends on how you want to look at it, I guess. But one of the things that was very big in French society is marriage. That's not to say everybody was perfectly married before the revolution and so forth. I'm not arguing that. But in a Roman Catholic nation, you know as well as I do, because I've taught you this, and if you didn't, if you knew it beforehand, all the better. But as you well know, marriage in the Roman Catholic system is a sacrament. It's extraordinarily important. And in the pre-revolutionary period, who married you? It wasn't the state. It wasn't a legal contract. It's not, you did not have the option in France to go down to the judge, as it were, and go get a license to get married. That's what we do. And you can have a church wedding, but you still go down to the district clerk's office or the county clerk's office and you go get a marriage license. I've got one sitting on my desk over here from Gloria and my marriage in 2006. And if you want to get married in the United States, you can get married at the JP, and in the eyes of the law, and frankly, in the vast majority of society, let alone the law, you are married. If you just get married by a judge. But that wasn't the case in pre-revolutionary France. As the revolution starts to pick up steam, even if you don't have the blood flowing in the streets, you're going to have new changes in marriage. So now you can go to a judge and get married, which takes, in a sense, very important power away from the church. That's a radical change. We may not recognize it as radical. That was for that time period. You're going to get a new constitution. You're going to get new citizenship requirements. You're going to get voting rights. And you're going to get taxes that are equally applied. All these things are radical in the early days of the Republic and the early days of the Revolution, and they are going to be portents and omens of even more radical aspects of life. So when we talk about the radicalization of the French Revolution, it doesn't happen overnight. It takes time. 1789 is when you see the 1789 is when you see the French Revolution begin at the storming of the Bastille. The king, by June of 1791, tries to flee Paris. He had been compelled to leave Versailles, his great palace. Versailles is going to be the great hall for so many events in the 19th and especially the 20th century. But he goes from Versailles and is brought back to the Tuileries in the Parisian capital. Parisian palace, and the king and his kids and his wife come back. But in June of 1791, the king, recognizing the lurch and the push of the revolution, also, I think, misplaying his cards and mishandling the situation, frankly, he tries to flee. And when he tries to flee France, and he's trying to flee to Belgium and the Low Countries, he does not fly quickly. He travels slowly. He travels ostentatiously, and he's stopped and he's captured and he's brought back. And really, when he tries to flee, the king, Louis XVI, tries to flee in 1791 in the summer. The fact is that really was one of the things that I think would cut the cord with the peasants, that they kind of, in a sense, throw their hands up and say, our king tried to abandon us in a time of need, and he left. So when it's all said and done, Louis XVI himself will be executed in January of 1793, his head brought forth and held up, and he is killed. So anyways, all that to say, though, is that he gets killed, and eventually his wife, Marie Antoinette, loses her head in the process. Thousands of aristocrats flee, and on top of that, it is pandemonium in the streets. By the time we get to the mid-1790s, I need you to add into your notes a new name. As the revolution radicalizes, those old revolutionaries who at the outset argued for a moderate course, an example would be Marquis de Lafayette. The Marquis de Lafayette was a friend of the American Revolution. He was a kind of a surrogate son to George Washington. He was beloved in the United States. In fact, Fayette County in Texas, where LaGrange and Round Top and a few other towns are, kind of south of here, but just north, but basically along the Schulenburg, along the I-10 between Houston and San Antonio. Fayette County is named for Marquis de Lafayette. Well, anyways, all that to say is that those more moderate voices are going to be pushed to the side as the more radical notions come forward, the more radical voices saying we need to reorder society, we need to remake society and create a new man and create a new society and a new order. A new time has dawned, and we are who we have been waiting for. We are who people have dreamed about. This is the time of maybe utopia, if you want to think of it that way. So when we talk about that new name you need to put in your notes is a man named Maximilien Robespierre. Maximilien Robespierre, R-O-B-E-S-P-I-E-R-R-E. Maximilien Robespierre. You can look it up, just type it in Google, he'll pop like that. Now, Maximilien Robespierre is nobody's example of a burly revolutionary. He's no Bolshevik in that sense, but he is a pedantic, small, retiring, voluble, true believer in the revolution. It is going to be Robespierre and his friends in his Committee of Safety, that are going to start issuing orders to arrest the enemies of the people, arrest the enemies of the citizens. They arrest the enemies of the Republic. And what do we do with those individuals? Well, we give them a mock trial, and then we condemn them to execution. If you've read Charles Dickens's Tale of Two Cities, that's set in that Reign of Terror time period. This is the Reign of Terror. And when we talk about old Maximilien Robespierre, he is looking to reorder society. How far do we go? And as I've already alluded to, it's very far. You're going to see thousands of priests and cardinals and bishops be executed or imprisoned for their belief. You're going to see the church stripped and its authority is taken away, not just in the land and the money and the privilege, but also the fact is who appoints the bishops, who appoints the priests, who makes them. In traditional understanding, even to this day, who ordains a bishop in the Catholic Church? Well, it is the Bishop of Rome, i.e. the Pope. The Pope is the man who lays hands on new bishops and new cardinals. It is the bishops and cardinals who had been ordained by the Pope in traditional understanding of Catholic practice. It's them who make the priest, as it were, ordain the priest. But not on this. This is going to be, if you wanted to be a priest, you needed to be licensed and you had to be legalized by Paris. And that is an upsetting of the whole apple cart, because in the smaller towns, it is these priests that are the most important individuals in the community, maybe more so than even the king's men. But they are going to be slaughtered, and they will be paying a price for it. So we're going to try, in a sense, especially in the Reign of Terror and the radical aspects of this revolution, we're going to try to rip out root and branch traditional religion. Does everybody fall away? Many do. And even those who don't, religion is never, meaning Catholicism is never quite the same again. Even after the collapse of the revolution, after the collapse of Napoleon, the religion and the state are going to be strictly, far more than the United States, strictly separated. And you're going to see this fissure in religion and in France. It really picks up steam in the 20th century, but the beginnings of this great fissure is here, and the church is going to pay with blood. So you have that. So not only do we need to sever church from society, and at the most, we worry, finish this thought on church and the destruction of religion in France, is that if you have church, it's not about salvation, because many of the individuals, such as Robespierre and his fellow followers, don't believe in any afterlife that's meaningful in the sense of like maybe a heaven or a hell. At most, maybe they believe that there is an afterlife, but it's just kind of a gauzy, soul disembodied understanding. And some of them would say that's even not true there. So what is the role of the church? They would say the church's role is charity at most, helping your fellow man. In a sense, it's a little bit like what you see with Jefferson, who, by the way, Thomas Jefferson was in France in the early days of the Revolution, and he had I would say Thomas Jefferson had a very rose-colored glasses view of the Revolution at times, especially compared to some of the others in the American government. So you have a wrecking there of religion. And so you have many who pay with their lives for their faith. But as I said, also you're going to see aristocrats killed. You're going to see that sort of thing there. But what you'll see too with the upsetting and the changing of society, the reorder of society, as I said, this is not just an attack upon the elites in the church. This is a reordering of society to the point where you're going to have a new calendar. No longer will you have Sunday through Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. No longer are you going to have January to December and all the months in between. This new revolution is going to bring forward a new calendar based on the decimals, a 10 count. Basically like it would be like saying it's the metric system calendar, in that sense, the revolutionary calendar. And they changed the names, they changed the days of the week. You no longer have 7 days of the week, you have 10 days of the week. And it's all, I mean, when you're going to that degree of depth of changing the calendar to reflect your view on life, that is a radical change. And so, for example, in the autumn, you're going to have Wintermeer, Brumaire, Freimaire, which is like frost and mist and vintage. Winter would be Nevos, Pluvios, Vintos, and I don't even know French, so I'm just trying to do my best French impression, and I can't. Some of you know some French and you're laughing at me right now, which would be fine, of course. And spring would be called Germinal, Floreal, Imperial. And then in the summer, Messidor, Thermidor, Fructidor. So when we talk about Thermidor, that's the month I want to remember because that's the apex of the Reign of Terror. It's the apex and the collapsing power of of Robespierre and his revolution. Thermidor, it takes from the word, the Greek word thermon, which is summer heat. And Thermidor basically is roughly about July 19th, 20th on the old calendar and runs through for basically about a month, starting with a new one, which would be Fructidor. But the reason I bring up Thermidor is because in July of 1794 is when the Robespierres of the world, the Robespierre movement, his Reign of Terror, his committee was going to go too far. One of the things that helped bring him down like it brought down the king was the mocking, the laughter behind his back. And he was also, by the way, something was said about Robespierre was he was incorruptible. I guess the older I get, in the sense more, baby, I become a cynic. But if you're incorruptible, if you're a man of principles, those principles can get you in trouble, and in this case can get you killed. Now, Robespierre probably was not an atheist, but he certainly was not a Christian or any believer in revealed religion. In fact, arguably, when we talk about Robespierre, and we would say June of 1794, 8th of June 1794, Robespierre understood that there was some role to be played by religion, at least some sort of deistic type religion, in the sense that you need to have virtue, and who can teach that? Well, a church or something like a church can, because there has to be some sort of overarching goodness or whatever, because there has to be a deity who will do it. So the fact of the matter is that when we talk about Robespierre on 8th of June of 1794, the 8th of June of 1794, the fact of the matter is that you'll see Robespierre and his intimate circle, they're going to call together a great festal celebration of the cult of the Supreme Being, which is about as disembodied deistic as it can possibly be. The cult of the Supreme Being, you'll see Robespierre coming down off of, as it were, a papier-mâché cloud, carrying something that looks suspiciously like tablets, and he is dressed in a toga, as I recall. Anyways, it was a odd sight. It was a strange sight. It was a laughable sight. And what it does is you mix his uber-zealous principles plus the ridicule that comes down upon him because of this cult of the Supreme Being, plus the fact that some of his friends, or perhaps the old phrase from a few years ago, his frenemies, might say, hey, this guy might turn on us and consume us. Instead of just we get to kill our enemies, he may turn and denounce us. So all this put together is by about July of 1794, Thermidor of 1794. Robespierre is going to be denounced himself, the tiger that he had unleashed on innocent and, well, not just innocent, but also guilty people in this reign of terror. And when I say guilty, there is going to be examples of folks who denounce others so they can get their land. Others, these seemingly pure who denounce the enemy of the people and get them killed so they can get a hold of their properties and such. There's a whole background story that we're not going to get into in this class because it's inappropriate for the sweep of a survey in American history. But all that to say is that old Robespierre is going to get his, and he's going to be killed by it, and he's going to be killed by his revolution. His revolution is going to cut off his head. In fact, actually, when Robespierre, was about to be executed, he knew that his time was up. Some of his friends who were also to be executed at the same time killed themselves. Robespierre tried to kill himself by sticking a pistol right here. But while he was, his enemies were literally banging on the doors of his chateau, he takes that pistol and he's going to kill himself with a shot through the face and up through the skull. He misses, he rushed the shot, and he twisted the gun over, blows out the side of his jaw, and he's laying in a pool of blood and broken jawbone as his enemies find him. He lives through the night. His enemies take him to the guillotine the next day, and like thousands of others before him and others who will follow him, he too is going to have his head cut off. But this reign of terror, at least in the Robespierre aspect of the reign of terror, is only an abatement. You're still going to have mob rule. You're going to have mob action. You're going to have fighting there in France. And it takes until October 1795 for the mob of Paris, particularly, to be brought to heel. And that's going to be done by a young artillerist who had made a name for himself fighting the battles of France. Because one of the things France had to deal with is not just the upheaval of the revolution at home, but the fact is that you're going to have a lot of nations come against France. And so France has to rally Republican armies to repel invasion. And at the same time, France sometimes will go on the attack against the Austrians, for example. And that young man is the most important individual in the 19th century, period. You may disagree with me, you may say some other character, but I can think of no greater individual, no more important individual in the history of the 19th century, especially in military affairs, but just in general history, than Napoleon Bonaparte. There may be others who are close to him, maybe Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor of Germany, because of what he sets the stage for in the First World War and the Second World War of the 20th century. But who knows? But Napoleon Bonaparte, he is not small in stature. That's an English propaganda ploy. The fact of the matter was Napoleon, is Corsican. He's not French, at least not Parisian in that sense. He's average height, average build for the time period, about 5'6", so he's no short man. But at the same time, he is a completely ruthless individual. He is also, some people have said, he was an example of the Enlightenment, or at least the French Enlightenment on horseback. And if that's the case, then there's a whole lot of other things that can be said about other famous individuals. But what he does in October 1795 that brings him to far, far more prominence than he had before was in October 1795, Napoleon and some of his troop had been ordered into the streets of Paris to stop the mob. And as this mob was advancing down this one thoroughfare, this boulevard in Paris, Napoleon says to his artillerist, his artillery chieftain, he says, give them, meaning the mob, give them, quote, a whiff of grape shot. Give them a whiff of grape shot. And it's one of the great quotes with Napoleon, who himself seemingly was able to spew out great and memorable quotes throughout his entire life. And they gave them that whiff of grape shot. The mob was shot down in the street. And the mob, at least for the next generation, never overtook the streets of Paris again. Certainly not when Napoleon was in charge. And so he brought some semblance and order. But he was a conqueror. He's one of the great military chieftains of all time. You will look in American history, men who are going to make their name in American history, such as, say, like in the Civil War of the 1860s, where we'll finish this course out this semester. The thing is, Napoleon is going to be well known by all of those officers who had gone to West Point in the 1840s or 50s. Those men who had studied at West Point, New York, the heartland, the birthplace of American officers in the 19th into the 20th and now to the 21st century. They studied Napoleon. They emulated Napoleon. They tried to be Napoleon in some cases. You'll see them act as such. I mean, you can't. Maybe you can see it a little bit here, sticking their hand in their shirt. But that was Napoleon. McClellan will be called the Little Mac, Little Napoleon. Down the road in Mexico, Antonio Lopez de Santana, especially, or Santa Anna, as you may have heard him called, Santana is going to love the nickname that he is given. He's called the Napoleon of the West. And on we can go. But what was it about him militarily? It was the fact that Napoleon, well, number one, he conquers most of Europe in his during his heyday. At his high tide, at his zenith, he controlled all of continental Europe. And the only nation in Europe that he basically did, in continental Europe, with the exception of Russia, of course, which is Russia and it's big, and some of you already know the story about that, Napoleon. But the only nation he was not able to conquer, and he hated them. He hated them with a passion. It was the British. He hated the British. He referred to them as Albion, perfidious Albion. Britain, treacherous Britain. And then at other times he referred to them as nothing but a nation full of damned shopkeepers. The English is a nation full of damned shopkeepers. In addition to that, even, Napoleon is going to say very vividly, he's going to try to invade them, but he can't figure out how to get his troops in enough space, and enough boats across the English Channel. The Channel plus the Royal Navy was too big of an obstacle. But the British are going to be his thorn in the side. It's going to be the thing that he's going to struggle against. It'll be a death struggle between him and the British. But what he did, though, in the meantime, before he goes to his Waterloo, before Napoleon is wrecked in Moscow, and then later Waterloo for good, and sent into exile by the British, the fact of the matter is that Napoleon will conquer Spain. He will conquer Austria. He will have control over the Italian city-states, Prussia, the German states, basically all the way to the gates of Russia and beyond. Napoleon's empire at its heyday in about 1808 or so, 1810, is going to be impressive. The thing is that Napoleon was a real believer in divisional warfare. He's a believer in dividing and getting into the climactic battle, getting your enemy on the run, driving them from the field through maneuver, amongst other things, massing your troops where appropriate and so forth. He had manuals written. He was a deep and great thinker in the art of war. Some of his greatest battles, like Austerlitz and Jena, are still studied to this day about the tactics of Napoleon. Others, perhaps down in Egypt there as well. But Napoleon also revolutionized not only the way to fight and how to fight a battle, he also revolutionized how to lead an army. He took some of the principles of the ancients, such as a Julius Caesar or a Gustavus Adolphus, and Napoleon's going to apply them to himself and to his army. If you've been to my office, and some of you have, you may have noticed there's a portrait of Napoleon sitting on horseback. And Napoleon on horseback is looking back over his shoulder. And he's actually looking at this grenadier who is yelling, "Vive l'Empereur." It's at the Battle of Jena. It's a very famous event. It was captured, and Napoleon had many, many portraits done of him in combat or action and so forth. There's another famous one of him dressed in his finest, pointing the way over the Alps, and his horse is reared up, and it's about to cross the Alps. Actually, that wasn't true at all. It was he was crossing the Alps, but on a mule, and he was not dressed in his finest. But these are portraits, not photographs. But back to that Jena portrait in my office that is extraordinarily famous, is that if you looked at it and you've seen it, Napoleon is not wearing all the scrambled eggs and stars and this and that and all the buttons of position and rank. Napoleon was always conspicuous by his, in the field at least, conspicuous by his regularity, by his commonness. He would wear a common blouse, a common set of riding shorts, boots, a peculiar set of cover. He always looked and stood out from his officers and others. Oh, by the way, it was not uncommon for, say, Caesar. Julius Caesar was always marked by his scarlet or crimson cape and cloak. So those sorts of things are there. Napoleon also is going to establish the modern medal system. Yes, the Purple Heart system, the ribbon, the Purple Heart that we have today goes back to Washington, but the medal system, like the Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross or Navy Cross, the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, and others that are more like for unit citations and such, that's all Napoleon. And Napoleon believed it a good thing to reward soldiers for being valorous and daring and having esprit de corps and having all that moral. And that's a word you need to write down, moral. And I don't mean that like he's got good morals. He is an honest man. He's true to his wife. I don't mean morals like that. But he believed in the morale, that would be our term, the morale associated with troops that were well motivated. And one of the ways he believed in motivating troops was awarding them medals and awarding them ribbons. But it's also always important to remember about Napoleon, who led his troops and could be very charismatic. He could also be very cynical, because as one story goes, and it may be a little bit apocryphal, but it's considering if you read the life of Napoleon, you can believe it. Napoleon is sitting there looking at one of these medals, and he says in so many words, "It's amazing what men will do for so little or so cheap a trinket." And he's holding basically the Croix de Guerre. And he's looking at that, and he just kind of dismisses it. A very cynical sort of man at times. But he's also a person who believes that men are extraordinarily important. And more particularly, the man is important. In war, as he said, the men are nothing, but the man is everything. And but going to that, he also believed in good leadership, great leadership. Of course, he knew that he was a great leader, and he was in his own right. But he also believed not only in great leadership and in that sense, but he also believed, too, that not only do you have great leaders, but men, even weak men, even doubting men, who were led by a great man or great men, meaning dynamic leaders, could transform an army. And he said it like this, and you'll see others say various versions of it. I think it's actually a quote that goes back into probably the Roman era, but the idea is the same. It goes like this. Napoleon said it this way, basically. He said, "I would rather face an army of lions led by a lamb than an army of lambs led by a lion." And it's that idea of leadership is extraordinarily important. If you have an army of lions led by a lamb, heaven help you. And if you got that, the lions will be slaughtered, because the lamb or the donkey in some other versions of the quote is going to get them all killed, or not going to do what they wish. But other famous statements by Napoleon, militarily speaking: an army travels on its belly. Now, that was a good one. You need to feed the army well. You need to supply the army well. And he tried to do that for the most part. It all breaks down, of course, in Russia in about 1812-13. But also it's worth noting, too, is that Napoleon is going to also say this, and I think this is maybe one of his best quotes. The moral is to the physical as 3 is to 1. If the men believe in their commander, if the men believe in their mission, if the men believe, well, that's far more important than do they have the finest equipment and the fullest belly. Because I have read history, and some of you have too, and maybe you've even seen it, maybe not on a battlefield, but if you've seen, say you take a sports team, you ever seen a team, and some of you may have played on a team in high school, that should have won a district championship or gone deep into the playoffs, yet their moral was so bad, or their morale was so bad because there was infighting or distrust or selfishness or whatever it was, maybe bad leadership by the coach even, that you didn't even make the playoffs. And some of you may have the opposite effect, that you had such good leadership on a team, though your equipment and your ability was lacking, you went deep into the playoffs. You maybe won a state district championship or something like that. That's that idea. The moral is to the physical as 3 is to 1. So, anyways, all that to say is Napoleon is transformative on the battlefield. People will read his works to the present time, trying to divine and trying to glean principles and ideas from it. So anyways, beyond that, Napoleon is also transformative of a character, because not just does he conquer Europe as a military chieftain, he continues the assault upon the church, though at times he will bring the church out of disrepute. It will be Napoleon who has hundreds of priests killed. at his order. Yet at the same time, and Napoleon, by the way, has no use for revealed religion of any stripe. Yet at the same time, the very cynical man himself is going to take with him a Catholic priest to his exile in St. Helena Islands in the South Atlantic. And why? Well, why did he take a priest that he didn't believe in and who he actually ridiculed on the way down there? He said it himself as he was dying on his deathbed of stomach cancer in the 1826, I guess. He was asked by one of his subordinates who were there, Emperor, why do you ask to be baptized in the Catholic Church? And you've never believed in Catholicism all your life. You've often ridiculed the church and made fun of the pious. And Napoleon's answer was supposedly, only a damned fool dies an atheist. So all that to say is that Napoleon on the church side is kind of an enigma. He's certainly a cynic and what have you. As far as his governance is concerned, all the power was to be his. He was an emperor, and that's what he is called to the day he dies, l'empereur. The fact of the matter is he wrecks the liberties of the republic. But that's not uncommon. It happens quite often in the history of man. If it's a republic or some sort of quasi-democracy, strong men step forward and knock it aside. That's not unusual. It may not be good, but it's not unusual. But the fact is that when you talk about Napoleon, positively, Napoleon is going to redo the legal code of France. To this day, the French legal code at its core is Napoleon's code. If you want to go and be a lawyer in Louisiana, which was a French owned at the outset, you needed to go to school in Louisiana. You need to go to law school in Louisiana. You need to go to LSU or Tulane or whatever the other law schools over there are. Tulane's the good one. LSU's pretty good as I understand things. But the Louisiana legal code is basically the old Napoleonic code plus some English ideas grafted on over the years. All that to say is that the Napoleonic code is part of his organizational pattern of the legal system. That's a great thinker. On the idea of how he lives and what type of way he works, he has a first-rate set of brains in the sense that he can line up a half a dozen secretaries and start dictating basically like a machine gun going off, this, and this, and he writes 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 letters at the same time. He is able to multitask. He never sleeps. He sleeps 4 hours a night. So, of course, you may say, well, how do you do that? Most of us can't try to pull that off for a week or 2 or 10, maybe even a couple of years. But at some point, your body and your health break down, and you look old and you get worn out. I can speak from experience on that. Some of you may try that. Very few of us can pull it off. But Napoleon at age 40 looked like he was 60. But he would always take those cat naps during the day. And so that was part of it too. In addition to that, just a rapier wit. He treated at times his sycophant friends poorly. Most of the time he seemed to do that because there was only one sun in the sky, and that was him. And then, of course, there's his wife, Josephine, who Josephine had survived. She's an elite. She's an aristocrat. She had survived the great bloodletting. She had survived the Reign of Terror. And she did that through basically taking on lovers who could protect her. And it's a sad statement about the time period, but it is what it is. So she survived. Then she hitched her wagon in 1794-5 territory to Napoleon. And Napoleon loved her, I think, and she was about 10 years older than he was. He loved that woman, and yet it was Napoleon. It was Napoleon that is going to. He's going to have to deal with her. While Napoleon was in Egypt, he kept writing these letters, and he was in the field in the early days of his ascent. Napoleon writes his wife and says, "Josephine, the love of my life, come and be with me. I need you. I need you around me. I can't live without you. Please come with me to the field." And Josephine, she laughed at him, and she thought it was silly, and he was just a rube. He wasn't he was not of the aristocratic type, and she ended up just going off and having some affairs willy-nilly. Well, word got back to General Napoleon. This is before he's emperor. But General Napoleon finds out that his wife has cheated on him. And he is distraught. He tells his friends in his inner circle, he says, "I am going to retire from public life. I'm going to go back to my chateau. I can't take it." And he's going to walk away, and he's going to let this destroy him. And I'm going to divorce Josephine. And that was the big one. Now, you may try, by the way, you may try to wreck society's mores, but you don't normally do it quickly and overnight. You may legally do it overnight, but the way people think about things, it takes time. But even in the post-reign of terror, and even with divorce laws loosened and marriage changed fundamentally in the way it's done in France because of the revolution, the idea, even amongst elites, who they themselves may have many, many lovers and an adulterous affairs, the idea of getting divorced was something you didn't do. You may have the affair, you may do this, you may do that. The morals of that are bad, I would say. But all that to say, though, is that still the idea of divorce, even in a dysfunctional marriage, was an anathema. And Napoleon's friend said, you can't do that. You can't divorce her. If you divorce her, you're done. You're toast. You have no future. And so Napoleon, as he goes to confront Josephine about her infidelity, he'd already, by the way, when he found out that she'd taken lovers, he decided he was going to get back at her, and so he took on an affair or two. When it was all said and done, they get back. Napoleon gets back to Paris, and word gets to Josephine that her husband was back, and she knew he was coming, and then word got to her that he was going to divorce her and leave her on her own and abandon her, as it were, and she would be cut loose, and she goes to Napoleon's chateau on the edge of Paris, and there she finds him in his bedroom. He locks the door and he locks himself in his bedroom. In the great climactic scene, she's banging on the door intermittently and crying through the door, "My honey, my love, they meant nothing to me. They all were just. I will never cheat on you again. Forgive me. I'm sorry." And Napoleon was crying and she was crying. They're all crying. It's really a dramatic soap opera. But was it Joseph? I think it was Napoleon's brother Joseph, who finds them the next morning. They had made up. Napoleon had unlocked the door and he found his brother and his wife together in bed, and they had obviously made up and things were better. But for the rest of their married life, Josephine will never cheat on Napoleon again. She learned her lesson. But Napoleon will never hesitate to cheat on Josephine ever again. He was a cynical and a cold-blooded chap. But it was because of Napoleon is that we're going to get sucked into, and the British. Napoleon's going to have his great moments, and he's going to have we're going to get sucked into the War of 1812 because of Napoleon. We're also, because of Napoleon, going to be able to purchase Louisiana, which I'll deal with at this point. It's a 56-minute count on the video, so I'm going to make another one. But it's Napoleon's going to allow us to purchase Louisiana in toto. But Napoleon, ultimately, as we know, he's going to meet really two defeats. The big one that breaks his back and destroys his grand army for all intents and in a sense, it's they're never the same again sort of thing. It's his invasion of Russia that goes oh so terribly. Go in with hundreds of thousands of men and they come out with like 1,000. Just a complete disaster. So moral of the story is don't invade Russia, and if you do, don't invade it when you can get caught in the winter. So that's number one. Secondly, of course, very famously, the British and the Prussians under the British under the Duke of Wellington, the Prussians under von Blücher, are going to deliver a knockout blow to Napoleon. There's a lot of great stories about Napoleon coming back from the first exile in Elba, coming up to Paris, organizing the army on the run, going to meet the threat. But at Waterloo, the British and the Prussians, after a day of fighting, are going to finally knock Napoleon out. And it, of course, gives us the term in English, so-and-so met his Waterloo. And that is the last battle of Napoleon's life. He is sent into exile in the South Atlantic, and there he lives out the rest of his days until about 1826, for the last decade of his life. He writes his memoirs and eventually succumbs to stomach cancer, in all likelihood. All that to say, though, is that Napoleon's life is extraordinarily important in many, many, many books of this thick or greater. Volumes and volumes of books, and trees on top of trees have died because of him. And frankly, a lot of men, too, other men trying to emulate Napoleon the Great. So here we are, Napoleon, the greatest individual, the most important individual, and great does not mean good, but the greatest individual of the 19th century, who's going to profoundly impact and his revolution and the revolution that predates him is going to profoundly impact the first 4, maybe 5 administrations in the history of the United States. And that's where we'll pick up in the next lecture. Thank you.